Hi everyone! So in my previous video we looked at energy and the conclusion was already quite clear. China starts from a very strong position, especially because its electricity base is much cheaper than in Europe, the US or Japan. And since energy is one of the foundations of industrial power, today I want to go one step further and look at how China's industrial market share has evolved over the last 30 years. Let's start with the sectors people a few years ago usually had in mind first when they heard the word made in China. Textiles, footwear, furniture, wood, paper, printing, and more broadly, a large part of everyday consumer manufacturing. And I say a few years ago deliberately because today that image is clearly too narrow. More and more people now understand that China is no longer just associated with cheap consumer goods. But that older perception did come from something real. Because this is where China first became a giant before moving much further. If you take textiles, apparel, leather and footwear, the change is extraordinary. China goes from 6.6% of world value added in 1995 to 48% in 2025. Japan falls from 14.7% to 1%, the United States drops from 15.6% to 2.9%, and the European Union goes from 26.2% to 7.8%. At the beginning, the explanation was fairly straightforward. China had lower labor costs, a huge labor pool, coastal export zones, rapidly improving infrastructure, better ports, and a state that was clearly pushing industrial expansion. Foreign companies moved production there, suppliers followed, subcontractors followed. And once those clusters were in place, relocation became much harder, because moving one factory is easy compared with moving an entire ecosystem. The more interesting part came later. The standard development story says that a country first wins the labor-intensive sectors, then wages rise, and then the sectors gradually move away. But that's not what really happened in China. In many cases, China kept them. You can see that beyond textiles. In wood, paper and printing, China rises from 2.3% in 1995 to 27.5% in 2025. In furniture and other manufacturing, it goes from 1.1% to 13.9%. So China built a position across a whole range of everyday manufacturing sectors and managed to hold on to that base even as the economy became more sophisticated. Once an industrial ecosystem reaches that level of density, the source of competitiveness changes. Supplier proximity, logistics, packaging, tooling, shipping speed, working capital, and port efficiency start to weigh as much as wages, sometimes more. That helps explain why companies like Shenzhou International became major integrated garment manufacturers for global sportswear brands, and why Nandragon Paper grew into a giant as China's export machine, retail system, and broader manufacturing base demanded huge volumes of packaging and paper products. The other major regions move the other way, but for different reasons. The United States was already a much richer economy and had long stopped specializing in the most labor-intensive parts of manufacturing. A large part of those sectors was offshored. Japan did the same, but its decline was even sharper because offshoring came on top of slower domestic growth, an aging population, and a much more mature industrial structure. Europe kept real strengths in branded goods, design, higher-end niches, and quality segments, but in broad industrial volume, it steadily lost ground. Food, beverages, and tobacco follows a different logic from textiles or furniture. Here, the main driver is domestic scale. Over the last 30 years, China didn't just become a bigger factory, it also became a much bigger consumer economy. Urbanization reached 67% in 2024, per capita disposable income reached approximately 41,000 yuan, and food, tobacco, and liquor still accounted for 29.8% of household consumption expenditure. That is the kind of scale that allows large domestic groups to emerge in grain, dairy, beverages, and branded food, with names like COFCO, Illy, and Mengniu. This also helps explain the relative decline of the other regions in that chart. In Japan, this sector is closely tied to demography and domestic demand, so the shrinking and aging population became a major headwind. In Europe, the industry remained very large, but it was already a mature consumer market, so growth was naturally much slower than in China. In the United States, the decline is much less severe, because America kept both a huge domestic market and powerful global champions. So the movement here is about China adding an enormous new consumer base on top of its industrial rise. Already at this stage, one thing is clear. China became the world's manufacturing base and held that position for much longer than many expected. Then the picture changes again. The next step is where China stopped looking like a simple assembly platform and started looking like a full industrial system. Look at basic metals, chemicals, rubber, plastics, glass, cement and other non-metallic minerals, and petroleum products and coke. These are not the sector people mentioned first, but they sit underneath almost everything else. When a country becomes very strong in this field, it moves deeper into the industrial chain and starts building the material base on which other industries depend. And the numbers are huge. In basic metals, China rises from 6.5% in 1995 to 41% in 2025. In chemicals, from 3.9% to 27.1%. In rubber, plastics, glass, cement, and other non-metallic minerals, from 5.5% to 40.3%. And in petroleum products and coke, where the United States remains very strong, China still climbs from 3.8% to 18.1%. This is also where the link with my previous video becomes direct. Steel, glass, cement, chemicals, and refining are all heavy energy intensive industries. So when a country combines structurally cheaper electricity, a large coal base, and a huge wave of urbanization and industrial investment, the result is powerful. That is exactly what happened in China. The country went through a phase of very large-scale urbanization, infrastructure expansion, property development, and industrial capex. It was building highways, ports, railways, airports, power plants, factories, industrial parks, and housing on a scale the other three regions were no longer matching. Demand surged for steel, cement, glass, plastics, chemicals, and refined products. And over time, China built the capacity to supply them domestically on a huge scale. That helps explain why a company like China Baowu carries so much symbolic weight. China's steel industry started out much more fragmented, then consolidated into larger group, and the 2016 combination of Baosteel and Wuhan Iron and Steel helped create the flagship that later became the biggest steelmaker in the world. In chemicals, the pattern is slightly different, but the direction is the same. Sinopec became one of the central integrated players in energy and chemicals. Wanhua rose from much smaller beginnings into a major global name. The shift became so large that even Western incumbents had to adapt. BASF says it very clearly. Greater China accounts for less than 15% of BASF's own sales, but roughly 50% of the global chemical market. The other three regions again tell very different stories. Japan starts from a very high level and then loses ground almost everywhere in these upstream sectors. In chemicals, in basic metals, and in petroleum products and coke. That reflects a long process of restructuring in steel, petrochemicals and refining, in a country where domestic demand became much more mature and no longer had the same industrial pool. Japan's loss of share was not just the result of China's faster growth, it also reflected the gradual restructuring and reduction of its own upstream industrial base. Europe also loses a lot of ground, but for a different reason. The industrial base is still there, and the big companies are still there. But in many upstream sectors, the cost structure became much less competitive, especially because of energy. Chemicals, metals, and other heavy industries came under increasing pressure with more closures, more restructuring, and weaker growth than in Asia. The United States is more mixed. It also lost share in parts of basic industry, and there was real restructuring there too, especially in steel. But it held up much better in chemicals and remained clearly stronger in petroleum products and coke, because it kept a major advantage in hydrocarbons and petrochemicals. So once you add this part of the story, China's rise already looks very different. It was no longer just about assembling cheap goods for the world. China was building the industrial basement underneath those goods. And from there, the next move becomes even more important. It is one thing to become a large manufacturing base because foreign firms move production there. It is something much more important to start producing the machines, electrical systems and industrial components that factories themselves need. That is what happened next. In fabricated metal products, China goes from 2.2% in 1995 to 26% in 2025. In machinery and equipment, from 4.2% to 33.1%. And in electrical equipment, from 3.5% to 37.7%. Those are very large moves. China increasingly became a place that could equip its own industrialization. Here, we are talking about machine tools, industrial hardware, construction equipment, motors, transformers, batteries, control systems, appliances, and all the equipment a modern industrial system needs to expand on its own. You can see that in the rise of companies like Sany in construction equipment, or Midea, which moved far beyond household appliances and used the acquisition of KUKA to enter robotics and industrial automation. In the broader electrical chain, CATL became one of the emblematic names of the battery era. These companies show how far China had moved. It was increasingly building the core hardware of industrial power at home. The comparison with the other regions is again revealing. Europe holds up relatively well, especially in machinery and equipment, where it still stands at 21.5% in 2025. That reflects real strength in capital goods, industrial engineering, automation, and specialized machinery, with countries like Germany and Italy remaining major manufacturing powers. Japan starts from a very high level, then declines sharply. In machinery and equipment, from 28.6% to 9.9%, and in electrical equipment, from 34.3% to 7.7%. A lot of broad industrial volume moved away, while Japan kept its strength in more specialized segments like automation, components, and precision equipment. The United States is more selective again. In machinery and equipment, it goes from 20% to 14.5%. In electrical equipment, from 16.7% to 11.7%. Labor costs played a role, especially in the early offshoring phase, but that is only part of the explanation. China built a much denser industrial ecosystem with large supplier clusters, faster capacity expansion, and a much stronger domestic investment cycle. Over time, more of a broad manufacturing volume in machinery and electrical equipment shifted toward China because the whole system became easier, faster, and more competitive to run there. By that point, China had done three things at once. It had kept a broad manufacturing base, built the upstream material base underneath it, and added the sectors that allow industry to expand and reproduce itself. The next step appears in two sectors that people are generally much more familiar with today. In computers, electronics, and optical products, China rises from 3.7% in 1995 to 22.1% in 2025. Japan falls from 27.1% to 4.4%. The European Union drops from 15.6% to 8.9%. The United States also declines, but much less sharply, from 30.7% to 22.6%. China's rise in electronics began with the concentration of manufacturing in East Asia and especially in China. Electronics is one of the most internationally fragmented industries in the world, and over the last 2 decades, a very large part of that chain moved toward Asia. China absorbed assembly, suppliers, subcontractors, and over time, a growing part of the industrial ecosystem around them. Then, the Chinese corporate side became much stronger. Lenovo completed the acquisition of IBM's PC business in 2005. BOE, founded in 1993, became a major display producer. Huawei, established in 1987, grew from telecom equipment into a much broader electronic and devices group. So the Chinese rise in this sector came first from manufacturing concentration, then from stronger domestic firms growing inside that environment. The other 3 regions moved very differently. Japan and Europe lost a large part of their broad electronics manufacturing footprint as production networks shifted toward East Asia. The United States held up much better because it kept far more weight in higher value industrial segments that still sits inside this sector, especially semiconductors, integrated circuits, computers and peripherals, and measuring or testing equipment. So the electronics chart shows China becoming the main industrial platform of the sector, while the United States preserved much more of its position than Japan or Europe. Motor vehicles are one of the clearest examples of a shift in industrial power. In 1995, this sector was still dominated by the United States, Japan and the European Union. China was far behind at just 2.4% of world value added, against 24.6% for Japan, 23.3% for the United States, and 29.3% for the European Union. Then, year after year, China kept taking share. By 2025, China reaches 24.4%, almost level with Europe at 25.8%, while the United States falls to 13.5% and Japan to 8.6%. The first stage of that rise came through joint ventures and technology transfer. Volkswagen's first major joint venture in China dates back to 1984, and that gave China a channel to build capacity, absorb know-how, and scale up inside its domestic market. The second stage came later, once the Chinese market became large enough to support strong local firms. Then the EV shift accelerated everything. BYD, founded in 1994, moved from batteries into cars, and CATL, founded in 2011, became one of the key companies in the battery chain. According to the IEA, electric cars accounted for almost half of all car sales in China in 2024. And China represented almost 2/3 of global electric car sales that year. That gives China a major advantage in learning, cost reduction, and speed of iteration. Europe is still slightly ahead for now, and that reflects the depth of its car industry, especially in Germany and more broadly through groups such as Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Renault and Stellantis. But the direction is becoming more uncomfortable for Europe. The transition toward electric vehicles is moving faster in China than in Europe. And if that gap persists, the pressure on European market share could keep increasing over the next few years. Japan's decline is even more striking. It starts from 24.6% in 1995 and falls to 8.6% in 2025, even though Japanese car makers remain globally important. Part of the explanation is that the Japanese industry built huge overseas production network over time, so a growing part of its strength no longer sat inside Japan itself. Another problem is the EV transition. Japan is entering this phase from a weaker position than China, and also from a weaker position than many people expected a few years ago. If electrification keeps accelerating globally, Japan's relative loss of industrial weight in vehicles could continue. At this point, China had moved from industrial depth into more complex final goods on a scale large enough to challenge the old leaders directly. There are still sectors where the limits of a Chinese rise remain visible. The clearest examples are pharmaceuticals and other transport equipment. In pharmaceuticals, China goes from 2.6% in 1995 to 15.8% in 2025. That is a strong increase, but the European Union is still at 30.4% and the United States at 28.8%. Japan, meanwhile, falls from 18.1% to 2.6%. The older leaders still keep a clear advantage here. Europe and the US stayed ahead because this is a sector built on patents, regulation, clinical development, global distribution, and very long R&D cycles, with firms such as Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Roche, Novartis, and Sanofi. Japan also kept major pharmaceutical companies like Takeda, Astellas, and Daiichi Sankyo, but its overall industrial weight in the sector still eroded sharply. China is still behind, but the direction is changing. It already has companies like Wuxi Aptech and Fosun Pharma, and this is one of the sectors Beijing wants to push much harder over the next decade. So the gap is real, but it is also one of the gaps China is now trying most actively to close. In other transport equipment, the hierarchy is also still very clear. China rises from 1.7% in 1995 to 13.4% in 2025. The European Union stays around 16.9%. The United States remains far ahead at 38.4%. And Japan falls from 15.5% to 2.7%. That makes sense because this group includes sectors like aerospace and rail equipment, where engineering depth, certification, long industrial cycles, and entrenched ecosystems are decisive. The US still has Boeing, Europe still has Airbus, and those positions are not easy to challenge quickly. Japan is also interesting here because it shows both sides of a story. High-speed rail was one of Japan's great industrial symbols. China then learned fast, scaled much more aggressively, built a much larger network, and created national champions like CRRC. Japan remained an important historical reference in rail, but China became the much larger industrial force in the sector. And from my own French perspective, the comparison is also striking. High-speed rail used to be one of the obvious symbols of French industrial know-how. China learned from foreign technologies, developed its own industry, built a huge network, and today, when I go there, what strikes me is that the network is much larger, the trains are often cleaner, cheaper, and frankly more efficient than what we have in France. The same broad movement is starting to appear in aviation as well. China is still far behind Airbus and Boeing, and Chinese aircraft are still not in the same position internationally in terms of certification and acceptance, but China is now building its own planes, and over a long horizon, I wouldn't be surprised to see Chinese aircraft become real competitors to Airbus and Boeing. So the picture at the end is fairly clear. China has not taken the lead everywhere. In the hardest sectors, especially where regulation, certification, research intensity or very long industrial cycles dominate, the United States and Europe still hold the strongest positions. Japan shows how a country can keep important firms and know-how while still losing a lot of relative industrial weight. And China, even where it is still behind, is already building the base for the next stage of catch-up. And now we can step back and look at the full picture. On the global industry chart, China rises from roughly 4% of world industrial value added in 1995 to roughly 28% in 2025. Japan falls from about 23% to 5%. The European Union declines from around 26% to 16%. The United States also loses ground, but much less dramatically, going from about 22% to about 17%. China didn't rise because of one exceptional sector, one temporary cost advantage, or one short industrial cycle. It kept adding capacity, capabilities, and market share across more and more parts of the industrial chain. First in labor-intensive manufacturing, then in upstream materials, then in machinery and electrical equipment, then in electronics and vehicles, and even in some of the sectors where it's still behind, the gap is no longer fixed. That's also why the decline of the over 3 major regions doesn't all mean the same thing. Japan lost a very large part of the industrial weight it once had. Europe kept important strengths, but its position weakened in many sectors, especially the most energy-intensive ones. The United States proved more resilient, but even there, the overall direction is still one of relative decline. So in the next video, we will go one step further and look at how these gains in global market share across so many industrial sectors translate into China's economy itself. Thanks for watching this deep dive until the end. If you found it useful, feel free to like, subscribe, and share.